This is the story of my grandmother Bernadette Stenery. To me, she is Sito, which means grandmother in Arabic, the language of the Middle East, which is where her story begins.
Sito was born in Utica in 1940 in upstate New York. She is one of 9 siblings, which eventually became 8, as unfortunately one of her siblings died at an early age. She is the youngest of the 9 siblings, so she was predictably the favorite.
Her parents were straight off the boat from Lebanon. They came over legally in 1922 to Ellis Island on a ship called the Olympic, which left from France. At this time, France and Lebanon were in collaboration, so it was understood that she came over on a Lebanese ship. Her father's name was originally Essa George Shahood, but they didn't know how to spell Shahood, so they just dropped it. Hence why my grandmother's maiden name is George, which became Stenery when she married my grandfather.
Sito's parents lived during the Great Depression, along with 4 of their children. Since Sito is the youngest, she was not born at that time, so she can't speak much about it. However, her father told her stories about how he worked wherever he could to support his family. One job he had was working in a factory, but he really worked wherever he could earn a few extra pennies. Being an immigrant family, it was even harder to make money back then. Seeing as it was so hard to make money, her father was forced to go on welfare for 6 months to support the family. However, he hated that he had to take the money, and so he always kept track of everything he took, right down to the last cent. Amazingly, once he had a steady job and was able to support his family once again, he made sure to pay back everything that welfare had ever given him.
For her whole life, Sito lived in Utica, and my Aunt Renee still lives there today. Sito says it hasn't changed much since she lived there as a child. After the Great Depression, their family needed a new source of income, and so her father went into farming and worked the fields of different farmers, but this still wasn't a lot of money. One day, they were able to buy their own farm in New York State, but they didn't live on it. Eventually, they learned the trade well and owned multiple farms where all the family members worked. On the original farm, they grew different kinds of vegetables, but as time went on, they transitioned from vegetables to beans and peas.
In terms of their schooling background, her mother did not go to school except maybe 1 year, and her father went to school up until 5th grade. Her father's one wish for her and her siblings was that they were to graduate high school, because he never did. Growing up in a Middle Eastern family, the language barrier was a tricky obstacle to maneuver. Her mother and father spoke Arabic, as well as her first 5 siblings. Arabic was their first language, so they had to learn English. It was the only language spoken in school, so everybody had to learn it. Sito and all of her siblings went to a Catholic school from kindergarten to 8th grade, which was especially difficult for a Middle Eastern family because their customs were so different.
Growing up in a Middle Eastern family, the food was much different than what the other kids were eating. Most children had a peanut butter and jelly sandwich for lunch, while my grandmother ate a fried pepper sandwich. Sometimes she was self-conscious because she didn't have the lunches that the other kids had. Food is a very valued custom in Middle Eastern culture, as it is in many cultures. One tradition that was common in Middle Eastern families was to make Arabic bread and distribute it. Situ's mother used to mix 25 pounds of flour to make Arabic bread on a wooden stove. After it was finished baking, she distributed the warm loaves to neighbors in the surrounding area, which was a very important custom in her family. Another custom that was very important was the value of food itself. In her family, it was critical that she finish all of what was on her plate before moving to seconds. Unfortunately, Sito learned this the hard way. One night, when they were all sitting down to dinner, Sito had a little bit of stew left and went up to get seconds. Her father was upset that she didn't understand the value of food, seeing as they had gone through the Great Depression, so he made her sit down and eat the entire pot of stew. Poor 6-year-old Sito couldn't leave the dinner table until she finished the entire pot of stew.
Situ's story was similar to the Mrs. Everywoman in some ways, but different in others. There were many customs that Sito had to adhere to. One of these customs was getting along with her siblings, which was a common rule for all households. But coming from a strict background, her parents didn't want any sort of arguing in the house.
Whenever Sito and her siblings had an argument, they were expected to keep it quiet and figure it out on their own. Both of their parents expected a peaceful and quiet household, and it was up to them to figure out their own problems.
Another custom was that girls were absolutely forbidden from smoking. Men were not encouraged to smoke, but they certainly were not forbidden from it like girls were. Many of the Middle Eastern customs were much stricter and more tailored towards women than towards men.
Men were expected and encouraged to get a college education, which is another gap between men and women back then. If men wanted to go to college, they were applauded for it, but if women wanted to go to college, it was frowned upon. Women were supposed to grow up, get married, have a family, and stay home all day and take care of the children.
Honey, you decide. You always come up with something good.
Oh, sure, I always come up with something good. I'm so sick of planning meals. Have you any idea how many meals I've cooked in the 18 years we've been married?
No. How many?
Well, now, let's see. 365 days a year, 3 meals a day. That's 15, 18, 19, 1,095 times 18 years. 30, 17, 20, say, 5, 6, 19,710 meals.
What about last Saturday night when we had dinner at the Ramses?
All right, 19,709 meals.
And what about all the times that we went out to restaurants or we were invited out to dinner?
So I got a few meals off for good behavior. Make it an even 19,000.
Good. That's exactly how many times you told me the same sad story.
Oh, well, I don't care. Being a housewife is a big bore. Cook the meals, do the dishes, make the beds, dust the house. Cook the meals, do the dishes, make the beds.
Nowadays, women are encouraged to go into the workplace, which is a big contrast from the environment my grandmother grew up in. No girls in Situ's family went to college, and only one of her brothers went to college. The girls in Situ's family all worked as secretaries, and all but one of her brothers worked on the family farm.
Another custom was that both Middle Eastern and a little bit American was that people were frowned upon for wearing shorts. Men and women alike were expected to never wear shorts, even the Bermuda kind. Situ's family followed this custom, of course, and Situ's father was very against shorts on women, even once his custom had sort of faded away. One day, when Situ was married and had 3 kids, she went to have dinner with her family, and her father came into the kitchen. He saw that she was wearing shorts and proceeded to say, "Bernie, are you getting taller? Because your shorts are getting shorter."
To this day, this is a common joke in my household. The tradition has passed from my great-grandfather to my grandfather to my father, who frequently says it to me. Another custom that was common back then, and probably still is for many fathers today, was the fact that women were not allowed to date. For the most part, it was a Middle Eastern quirk, but a little part of it could also be tied to the fact that she's female. Women were not allowed to date until age 18, and everybody in her family abided by this rule. When they finally did turn 18, my grandmother dated my grandfather, Arthur Stenry Jr. Once they were married, they had my father first, then my Uncle Brian, and finally my Aunt Renee. My Aunt Renee had my 2 cousins, Samantha and Gabrielle, and my Uncle Brian married my Aunt Denise, who then had my cousin Jessica. My father married my mother and had my brother and me.
Growing up as the youngest child, I can confirm that the youngest is always the favorite. Like me, Situ is the youngest, so she was always spoiled. Her father seemed to have an especially soft spot for her. One example of this was when the television was just becoming popular. Situ was infatuated with the idea of a television, so she went over to her aunt's house, who lived next door, and was so disappointed when they turned the television off. She was so upset about it that her father went out and bought their family a TV, just because Situ wanted one. Another story that shows that Situ was always the favorite was when her father went out and bought her a bike. None of her brothers and sisters had a bike, because it wasn't common for kids to have bikes back then. But seeing as Situ was the favorite, she got a bike.
Growing up in a Middle Eastern household, Situ faced many obstacles while having an amazing childhood. She is both the epitome of America's Mrs. Everywoman, yet challenges that in every way because of the Middle Eastern customs that influenced her. Nevertheless, I look up to her every day and try to live my life as my Situ would.